5:05 p.m., March 23, 1994. Lomas Tarinas, Tijuana. A poor neighborhood at the edge of the border. Luis Donaldo Colosio, Mexico's presidential frontrunner, steps into a sea of hands and faces. His security detail has been systematically stripped away. Campaign coordinator Raul Zorrilla detained key personnel at the airport that morning. The crowd presses in. Too close. The formation is wrong. And somewhere in that crush of bodies, two guns are about to fire. One from a factory worker named Mario Aburto. The other, prosecutors would later allege, from a federal intelligence agent named Jorge Antonio Sanchez Ortega. Within seconds, the man who threatened to expose the cartel government nexus would be bleeding out on the pavement, and Mexico's fragile illusion of democracy would shatter with him. But to understand why Luis Donaldo Colosio had to die, we need to rewind 17 days. March 6, 1994, the monument to the Mexican Revolution in Mexico City. Colosio stands before a crowd of thousands and does something no PRI presidential candidate had done in 70 years of single-party rule. He tells the truth. He speaks of corruption, of abuses of power, of impunity. He describes a Mexico hungry and with a thirst for justice. His words are careful, but the message is unmistakable. He's not just campaigning. He's declaring independence from the system that created him. President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, the man who handpicked Colosio as his successor, watches from the shadows of Los Pinos, the presidential residence. One can assume he understands immediately what has just happened. Colosio wasn't supposed to be a reformer. He was supposed to be a continuity candidate, someone who would protect the machine, preserve the arrangements, maintain the delicate balance between power and profit that had kept the PRI in control since 1929. But Colosio had seen something. Intelligence analysts suggest he had begun to understand the depth of the rot, that the Mexican government wasn't fighting the cartels. It was partnered with them, and that realization made him the most dangerous man in Mexico. To understand Colosio's fatal error, you need to understand what Mexico had become by 1994. On the surface, it looked like a success story. Carlos Salinas had opened the economy, privatized state industries, and signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that would supposedly transform Mexico into a first-world nation. Foreign investment poured in. The peso was stable. Mexico City's elites celebrated their arrival on the global stage. But beneath that glossy exterior, the country was being hollowed out by something far more insidious than simple corruption. The Gulf Cartel, led by Juan Garcia Abrego, had effectively purchased the Mexican federal government. Not metaphorically, literally. Swiss banking authorities would later determine that Raul Salinas de Gortari, the president's own brother, had received tens of millions of dollars from the Gulf Cartel. $120 million were frozen in Swiss bank accounts tied directly to Raul. But that was just what investigators could trace. The real figure, intelligence analysts believe, was far higher. Juan Garcia Abrego wasn't just bribing low-level cops or border agents. He was paying the Deputy Attorney General of Mexico more than $1.5 million per month for protection. Per month. Think about that operational reality for a moment. The second highest law enforcement official in the entire country was on the Gulf Cartel's payroll, earning more from cocaine trafficking than from his government salary by a factor of hundreds. This wasn't corruption. This was institutional capture. The distinction matters. Corruption implies a basically functional system with some bad actors. What Mexico had in 1994 was a narco-state that still wore the costume of democracy. And Luis Donaldo Colosio, the sociology professor turned politician, the man who had spent his career rising through the PRI's ranks by being competent and non-threatening, had apparently decided he couldn't be part of it anymore. His March 6th speech wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a declaration of intent. Those close to Colosio would later say he had been deeply disturbed by what he learned during the campaign. The extent of cartel penetration, the complicity of federal officials, the fact that Mexican democracy was essentially a performance art piece staged for international observers, while the real decisions were made in backrooms between politicians and traffickers. He likely felt trapped. He could either become president and perpetuate the system, or he could try to change it and become a target. He chose the latter. That choice would cost him his life. After the March 6th speech, Colosio's relationship with President Salinas deteriorated rapidly. Campaign insiders reported that Salinas stopped taking Colosio's calls. The flow of party resources slowed to a trickle, and then came the personnel changes. Key security figures replaced, trusted advisors sidelined, and the elevation of a man named Raul Zorrilla to the position of campaign coordinator. Eduardo Valle, a former top Mexican law enforcement official who later fled to the United States, would provide extensive testimony about Zorrilla. Valle alleged that Zorrilla had direct connections to Gulf Cartel cocaine traffickers and had played a central role in creating the conditions for Colosio's assassination. Valle's claims were specific, detailed, and supported by documentation. They were also conveniently never fully investigated by Mexican authorities. The morning of March 23rd, Zorrilla made several decisions that intelligence analysts find deeply suspicious. He detained key members of Colosio's security team at the Tijuana airport. The official explanation was that there were too many personnel and the group needed to be thinned out for logistical reasons. But the personnel who were detained weren't random. They were experienced protective agents who had been with Colosio throughout the campaign. They were replaced by new faces, people Colosio didn't know, people who had no established relationship with the candidate. Standard protective protocol in any professional security operation is consistency. You don't swap out experienced personnel on the day of a major public event in hostile territory. And make no mistake, Tijuana in March 1994 was hostile territory. The city was ground zero for the Arellano Felix organization's war with the Gulf Cartel. The Tijuana Cartel controlled the local plaza, but Garcia Abrego's Gulf organization was trying to expand its influence westward. Violence was escalating. Federal agents worked for both sides or played them against each other. And Colosio, with his reform rhetoric, was a threat to everyone's arrangements. The Lomas Taurinas rally was held in one of Tijuana's poorest neighborhoods, a deliberate choice to show Colosio connecting with ordinary Mexicans. But the venue created security nightmares. No barriers, no controlled entry points. Thousands of people packed into a small area with no way to screen them. Just before 5 p.m., Colosio finished his speech and began working the crowd. This was his style: personal, tactile, connecting directly with voters. But the formation was wrong. His remaining security personnel were pushed aside by the crowd surge. Colosio found himself surrounded, pressed in from all sides with no clear escape route. In that crush of bodies, two men likely had their hands on weapons. The first was Mario Aburto Martinez, a 23-year-old factory worker from Michoacan who had traveled to Tijuana specifically for the rally. Aburto would later confess to shooting Colosio, though his confession is riddled with inconsistencies and many analysts believe he was coerced or mentally unstable. The second was Jorge Antonio Sanchez Ortega, an agent with CISN, the Center for Research and National Security, Mexico's intelligence apparatus. Sanchez had no official reason to be in the crowd that close to Colosio, but eyewitness testimony and photographic evidence place him within arm's reach of the candidate at the moment of the shooting. At 5:05 p.m., 2 shots were fired in rapid succession. The first struck Colosio in the abdomen. The second struck him in the head, entering at an upward angle behind the right ear and exiting through the skull. The second shot was fatal. Colosio collapsed. Blood pooled on the pavement. The crowd erupted in chaos. Mario Aburto was immediately tackled and subdued. He was beaten by the crowd, then taken into custody. He would never leave prison. But Jorge Antonio Sanchez Ortega, the CISN agent, simply walked away. Eyewitnesses reported that his clothes were covered in blood. Colosio's blood. He left Tijuana that night, and then he vanished, protected by the same federal intelligence apparatus he had served. The ballistics evidence is what makes the official story fall apart. The autopsy revealed 2 entry wounds from 2 different angles and trajectories. The abdominal shot came from a slightly lower angle, consistent with a shorter person firing upward in a crowd. The headshot came from a different vector entirely, closer to level from the right side. 2 different shooters, 2 different weapons, likely. But the official investigation insisted on a single gunman. Why would you need 2 shooters? Redundancy? Professional assassination planning operates on the principle that any single point of failure can derail the operation. If Aburto failed to deliver a fatal shot, Sanchez was there as insurance. If Aburto's weapon jammed, Sanchez had a backup. It's the same operational logic used in high-level intelligence liquidations. You don't leave outcomes to chance. The escape protocol for Sanchez also suggests institutional support. He didn't flee to the mountains or try to cross the border. He simply returned to his regular life, confident that the apparatus would protect him. And it did. For 30 years, Jorge Antonio Sanchez Ortega lived openly in Mexico. He wasn't hiding. He was being hidden by the very government that was supposed to investigate the assassination. In 2024, 3 decades after Colosio's murder, federal prosecutors finally filed charges against Sanchez, formally accusing him of being the second shooter. The evidence was substantial. Ballistic analysis, eyewitness testimony, photographic evidence, and expert reconstructions all pointed to his involvement. A judge reviewed the case and declined to issue an arrest warrant. The official explanation was that the evidence, while suggestive, was insufficient for prosecution. But legal experts noted that the evidentiary standard used was unusually high, higher than what would typically be required for an arrest warrant in a murder case. The message was clear. Even after 30 years, even with a new administration supposedly committed to transparency, the Mexican state would not hold one of its own intelligence agents accountable for political assassination. The system was protecting itself. Mario Aburto, meanwhile, has been in prison since 1994. He was convicted of assassination and sentenced to 42 years. He maintains that he acted alone, though his story has changed multiple times over the years. Some investigators believe he's protecting someone. Others believe he's genuinely mentally ill and was manipulated into the shooting without understanding the larger conspiracy around him. The truth, as with so many things in this case, is probably somewhere in the murky middle. Aburto may well have fired the abdominal shot. He may have even believed he was acting alone for his own political reasons. But he was almost certainly part of a larger operation, whether he understood that or not. Eduardo Valle, the former federal official who tried to expose the cartel connections, fled to the United States in 1994 after receiving credible death threats. He testified before U.S. congressional committees about the depth of cartel penetration in the Mexican government. He provided names, dates, financial records. His testimony was detailed and damning. Mexico demanded his extradition. The United States refused. Valle remained in exile, watching from across the border as the country he tried to save descended further into narco-chaos. Because Colosio's assassination didn't end the cartel government nexus. It preserved it. With Colosio gone, Ernesto Zedillo became the PRI candidate and won the presidency. Zedillo was a technocrat, competent but not dangerous. He wouldn't threaten the arrangements. The machine rolled on. Juan Garcia Abrego continued running the Gulf Cartel until his arrest in 1996, not by Mexican authorities but by American agents who grabbed him just across the border. Even then, the Mexican government tried to protect him. It took pressure from Washington to secure his extradition. Raul Salinas, the president's brother, was eventually arrested in 1995 for money laundering and convicted of ordering the murder of his own brother-in-law. But the charges related to the Colosio assassination never stuck. He served 10 years and was released. The $120 million frozen in Switzerland was eventually returned to Mexico, though exactly where that money went remains unclear. Carlos Salinas himself fled to Ireland after his presidency ended, claiming political persecution. He later returned to Mexico and now lives quietly, his reputation rehabilitated in certain circles, his role in the assassination never formally investigated. The Colosio case remains officially unsolved, not because investigators don't know what happened, but because solving it would require the Mexican state to admit what it really was in 1994, a criminal organization with a flag. And that admission would be too dangerous, even now, because the structures that enabled Colosio's murder didn't disappear. They evolved. The Gulf Cartel fragmented. The Sinaloa Cartel rose. Los Zetas split off and militarized the entire industry. Violence escalated from thousands of deaths per year to tens of thousands. But the fundamental relationship, government officials on cartel payrolls, intelligence agents moonlighting as sicarios, prosecutors protecting traffickers, that remained constant. Colosio saw that system clearly for perhaps the first time in his political career, and he made the fatal mistake of thinking he could change it from within. There's a photograph taken moments before the shooting. Colosio is surrounded by people, reaching out to shake hands, smiling despite the crushing crowd. His face shows no fear, only determination. He looks like a man who believes in something larger than himself: democracy, justice, reform. Noble abstractions that meant nothing in Lomas Taurinas on March 23, 1994. Because in that moment, the only thing that mattered was power, and the people who held that power, politicians, cartels, intelligence operatives, had decided that Luis Donaldo Colosio was more valuable dead than alive. The question Mexico has never been able to answer is this: when the government and the cartel are indistinguishable, when the people sworn to enforce the law are the same people profiting from its violation, when an intelligence agent can murder a presidential candidate and live free for 30 years, what do you call that? Is it corruption? Or is it just the system working exactly as designed? Luis Donaldo Colosio believed Mexico could be something better. That belief got him killed. And 30 years later, the men who likely ordered his death have never spent a single day in prison. Justice, it seems, is just another abstraction, noble in theory, meaningless in practice, and always, always secondary to power. Share your thoughts below.